if in Futures and Foresight, we tend to fear the unknown, right? And it creates doubt, and therefore it is uncertain. We try to make sense of it so that we can, in fact, actually like psychologically, manage, this uncertainties, whatever that might be, and call it risk management in the process, and then they become products and services. Now, however, in the context of indigeneity, from an indigenous perspective, is that for them, the unknown is something that we must learn to respect. Instead of fearing it, you must respect it.
Sherman, welcome to Think Forward. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for inviting me to be a part of your show.
It's been long overdue. So I've been following your work for a long time, and you live in the Philippines right currently, but you've done a lot of global work. I think it's usually best to start with the journey that we all take. So tell people a little bit about yourself, your work, as a futurist, and more than that, but yeah, and what you've been doing in the community.
Yeah, so at the moment, I'm a full-time futurist. Every day that I do is really about, the future, and, been working with governments, companies, non-governmental organizations, and individuals who are interested about the future. And more often than not, they ask me to, provide them some information and context about what the future is, really, at least in the context of future studies. And when it is applied, of course, we all know this, Stephen, it's called strategic foresight. And more often than not, it depends on who are you talking to and the kind of invitation that you get. Sometimes you use different types of thinking hat, right? As a futurist, it depends on the invitation that you have. And of course, as far as future studies is concerned, you've got a pretty quite long I would say, spectrum of futures knowledge and foresight, and your client's interest is the opening for you, in fact, right, to discuss and make futures interesting for everyone. So, and I'm also a PhD student currently at the moment at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia, doing research on futures and foresight in the last 3 years. And I hope to complete the dissertation this year. It's a requirement that I have to finish, hopefully by July. And of course, I do a lot of consulting work. Yes.
Yeah, we're going to get definitely in to dive more into that, especially as what your focus is. Your work, prior to being a full-time futurist, you talked about in our call, kind of prep call, we talked about risk management. You did a lot of risk management work before the pandemic. We talked about kind of, I think many of us are either accidental futurists or stealth futurists. We bring it into our work. And do you find that that experience kind of helped you shape the futurist that you've become?
Yeah. In fact, in my ethno-linguistic community, when you try to translate the future, it's called Masakbayan. And I collaborated with a linguistic professor on this in one of the universities of teaching in one of the universities of the country. And we get to learn that the future is an experiential verb. So the future being an experiential verb, of course, we put context in what we do, and we bring our experience into the process. And of course, over 25 years of working experience, I would say, in different domain, from academia to research to government to corporate, and then now as a full-time consulting futurist. This variety of experience brought me in some sort of different ways of knowing the way we approach the future, as far as our communities and the actors and stakeholders that we engage with. And the first time I heard about foresight was when my professor in public administration, introduced the book Future Shock to us. Of course, by Alvin Toffler, right? Like that was like around, 95, 96, 97. That was pretty quite the most popular book on futures during that time, and even 5 years before that. And when I started reading it, of course, I learned that there's such a thing of there's such a discipline as of futures and foresight, not in the context of academia, but then of course on how Alvin Toffler, right, like analyzes how the speed of technological advancement would change the way we deal with time and speed and the impact of this technology to us in our way of living and lifestyle and working, and that if you cannot adapt, to how fast technological changes emerge, you can say that as some sort of a future shock and disrupt you in many ways. And after reading that book, I bought all of his books, 5 of his books. Yeah. And the revolutionary Alvin Toffler's Revolutionary Wealth was also brilliant. But then I wasn't after reading that. Of course, my perspective was into practice, not really in the context of future studies or research, until I learned about future studies as an academic discipline or as a discipline. From Swahili and Ayatollah when they offered the course in Malaysia. Around probably 2007, 2008, if I remember it right, 2000. You see, after a decade, right? When I started, yeah, I wasn't really into futures and foresight practice because I was into governance. As a chief of staff of a governor in our province, and of course the focus was on the day-to-day stuff. While we deal with, because during the time we had a national governance agenda called the Philippines 2000. That was in the around 1992, 1993. It was called the Philippines 2000, and the country was shifting from when Marcos was deposed, and then there were coups in between. And
was Marcos was that a military dictatorship, or was that just a straight like?
Yeah, he was deposed by his own general, who would later on become the president. The Philippine Constabulary president for Fidel Ramos, who was his cousin as well. And then he had after Cory Aquino, because Cory Aquino became the president, and then after Cory Aquino, then here comes a general who would later on become our president. And then he had this, vision of the country, but not 10 years, called the Philippines 2000. And it was pretty quite clear that, the agenda was economic growth and recovering from the crisis, setting up, addressing the power crisis, the energy crisis, among other, internal domestic struggles, right? Challenges within the country that and then that was during the time that Alvin Toffler's Future Shock was introduced to me. And then, and then after which, a decade after, I went back to the academia and teach again after my foray in local government. But before that, I was into music even before I became a futurist. So I'm a songwriter as well, Stephen. So I spent 2 years of my life before I started doing futures and foresight, and music gave me that opportunity to recenter myself, and recover probably like some sort of not necessarily a thinking self, but the creative self. In the process that led me to be really like go back into studying futures and foresight again. And that's when I hop on a plane, went to Malaysia, and attended a course by the World Future Studies Federation on future studies. And fortunately for me, the professors, the instructor who was there was, of course, Swahilene Tula, and then Alvin Toffler. No, not Alvin Toffler, but Jim Dater. I'm sorry. Yeah. And then when Jim Dater, spoke about, if there is an idea about the future, it must be ridiculous, and that got me hooked into futures and foresight, and it started really like deep dive into the idea of the preposterous futures. Of course, beyond the other alternative types of futures, which is pretty quite evident if you study foresight.
No, it's interesting. There's so many things to touch upon. One of the things I always talk about with fellow futurists, I feel like we're risk managers. Like our whole thing is to mitigate risk, because understanding possible futures and helping people navigate that is essentially another type of risk management, right? And it's kind of a natural evolution for your work, right? It's kind of a different, a longer horizon of risk management, but still, helping people mitigate that.
I've always been interested about the concept of crisis, right? Like it has always been in my plate, working in different agencies and institutions, right? And there has always been a strong interest about these things, and as you mentioned, the concept of risk. And of course, there are risks that are known to us, right? But then there are risks that are unknown to us. And, and we do not have, in fact, if you're not into features in foresight, I'm not even sure if you have the lens to look into, or probably, the space to even study the things that are known to you. But then, of course, in the context of security, peace and order, risk, and governance, primarily, these things always comes out. But then I think over the years, I started to realize that you don't really get to choose your crisis, right? You don't really get to choose. We don't, right?
You don't get to choose your crisis. You don't choose where you're born. Yeah, there's certain things that, it's interesting. You don't get to choose your. Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We don't get to choose our crisis, and if we don't get to choose it, of course, when you're faced with it, of course, you don't know anything about it. You don't have probably some sort of, probably a little bit of sense on how you make sense of it. But then when these are emergent types of crisis or unknown to us, like, for example, we've seen this on how Nicolas Taleb accentuated the idea of Black Swan, which even before he published it, futurists were, speaking about it and had been discussing this. And sometimes we call it weak signal, sometimes we call it, emerging issues. It depends on who we are talking to. But then, of course, there are parameters and conditions, that we acknowledge. Is that, we transcend ourselves through improvisation, right?
Yeah, it's true. And, I keep coming back to Toffler, and you're talking about all this, he's had a huge influence on my life. I read him and people who've listened to the show know that how much he's had an impact on my life, when I was 13 reading Third Wave, and then, obviously Future Shock, and, his, macro view and influence people, futurists of all kinds, can point back to him. But he's definitely, I think about the technology curves and waves, things that really he kind of instituted way before we talk about other types of, theory, but it's really about disruption, disruptive technology, which kind of leads me to your game, which is like you always think about disruption, right?
Yeah. So, it's some sort of an evolution as well. Like when I started Futures in Foresight, I was really interested about, what it was. And then, of course, it leads you to learning, understanding, and learning how to apply the tools and the methods in the process. And the tools and the methods are more often than not, as far as my practice is concerned, is action learning type. So when it is action learning type, you facilitate conversation and dialogue with people. And through this conversation, you use the tools and the methods to put order into knowledge in order for them to, have a better grasp of the complex things that they've been trying to, understand, and hopefully, generate insight that makes sense to them. So, and then eventually I realized that, you can in fact actually like do futures and foresight even without the tools and the methods, right? Explicitly, but you can.
Yeah, and so many different ways to come at futures work with so many different tools. I mean, there's so many different methods. Some are more, derivative of other things, or they're evolutionary of other things. But I think the core for me, playing with just dreams and disruptions, and people should know it's not a podcast, it's not a book, it's a card game. And like you said before, we don't get to choose our crises, and it's like you talk about the randomness. And I think a lot of times I call it safe futures. A lot of places try and kind of stay within their band of what they hope will be possible futures versus, I don't know, the wild cards are usually not so much in there. I think it scares people too much, or it's just not, corporate culture doesn't allow for it. But your game tries to kind of, I would say, get it more present in people's face. So
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, about the game, it's a one when we start building it, the intention was like to develop a features literacy card game, right? And as a features literacy card game, of course, gamification is in fact actually a method. More often than not, we understand we probably it depends on how you look at it. Sometimes you only see games as entertainment, as a form of entertainment, right? But then, of course, games are more than that. For the Dreams and Disruption game, it's a structured way to play the game, and help people build scenarios quickly by, of course, drawing the things that we usually do in foresight, like, for example, your forces of change, your disruptions, your leadership archetypes, and that brings out the worldviews that people have when they imagine the future, and using those games as your prompt cards, variables. It's a combinatorial game, in fact, and when people in fact actually like explore the future together, it creates some sort of a shared future space where imagination becomes collaborative. While it is collaborative, sometimes they also contest these types of imagination, and hopefully in the process, negotiate in a way that makes sense to all of the people who are playing the game. And over the years, in playing the game, what I learned and what I love about it is that while everyone is interested about the idea of uncertainty and not just talk about it, they get to realize that when you explore uncertainty, that they get to this was the insight that I had, was that uncertainty is a learnable environment. Uncertainty is a learnable environment, in a way that it gives people the opportunity to surface their assumptions that they themselves didn't even know that they were carrying all along the way. And because it's a game, it gives people an opportunity to, in fact, actually drop their inhibitions and whatever.
yeah, it's a safe space to be unsafe, right? If you will, to be unsafe. So I the term safe space just really kind of makes me kind of chuckle at, like, I went to Catholic school for like 12 years. There was, it's like, deal with it, buddy. So I think about what's one of the things I really like about your game too, beyond that, is also, for those of you who study social change, there's a lot of different social theorists out there. One of them is Sakar, and his law of social cycle, you actually pull leadership archetypes from that. So that, I think it's an important part, because organizational foresight is becoming more important, more relevant, not just making things a project, but making it ongoing. But in order to actually communicate it to leadership, there has to be some type of archetype. You have to have a grounding in that. So what made you choose that, and what are some of the archetypes, for example?
Yes. I drew some inspiration from a social Indian philosopher named Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, and in his the theory of change, central to his idea of as far as his theory of change is concerned, is the concept of his law of social cycle. For Sarkar, he said that in a society there's what you call a collective social psychology, and they are these are psychological archetypes, right? And for him, there are four types of psychological archetype, and more often than not, each and every one of us, at least at the unit level, has a dominant psychological archetype. So he reframed and redefined the concept of classes in the context of psychology instead of matter, right? Like the way economics actually looked at it. For him, there is what he called the labor mind, and the labor mind, in not necessarily influence the environment, but they participate in shaping the environment by using their bodies, right? So they build things. We've seen this, like for example, carpenters can actually like build stuff, and for labor psychology, of course, they have mental propensities that are pretty quite essential for them. Like for example, providing service to others, which are the good part of being a laborer. Like they're gonna provide the service even if they don't get paid for it, right? Like as long as they have the opportunity to actually serve others. But then, of course, as far as their participation in shaping, the social environment, is that they get to build things. Now, another one is the military archetype, the military psychology archetype. These people are pretty quite strategic, right? Like they're good at planning. They have a tendency to really like embrace this concept of order, right? Like and of course, one said, he said that the power is in a barrel of a gun, so they can in fact actually like influence the environment through force. And of course, we've seen this in the past, at least at the civilizational level, I would say. That at some point in our in our history, of course, it was all about the military, right? Like, like
Yeah, I mean, all it's about control, right? Control of population, control of land, control of resources. Resources, yeah.
wanted to become a soldier, right? Like the Roman civilization, right? Like at some point, right?
Yes, absolutely. You were either a soldier, a merchant, or a worker, or a slave, right? Exactly, a labor. Yeah. Well, and it kind of leads. It's a really good point you make, because you talk. You've always asked that. I've heard you ask this question a few different ways, different times. If the future is colonized by fear or poverty of imagination and greed, what does it mean? And I use this word, I'm going to use it in your statement, decolonize foresight. And why should futurists here in the West like pay attention to it? I want to preface before we get into that, define in your term decolonization. I like to use the word deconstruction because it's, I think, a little less. There's a provocativeness in that, but there's also opinion when you hear colonizing. Like, what is that? What is it like? There's a deconstruction element to it, but yeah, talk about like that question. Like, what does it mean? Like, what does that mean for you?
You know, a lot in terms of you try to contrast colonization from decolonization, right? Like, if you come to think about it, it's really about power. The dynamics of power, right? In a colonial era, for example, right? Like your ways of knowing, your ways of being, you know, what's real for you, the way you imagine things. If it's colonized, is that you might be unconsciously imagining, how the world is perceived by others, right?
That's a great. That's a nice definition. That's a good definition. Yeah, because it makes people think broadly in that sense, which I think is incredibly important, especially as foresight. It's taken on in different form, right? Different ways, right? And SIASIP, right? We talked about that, right? What it means, it means foresight in Filipino. You and I've talked about that. So, what does it mean for you? What do you think people in the West should pay attention to? With
And then before I respond to that, right, like, and then just to contrast it with decolonization, is that the colonization is an effort for you to actually like be aware about it, right? Like that the way you imagine and probably perceive the future has been colonized, right? Because when there is some sort of a monotony or a linearity or singularity in the way we perceive the future, as if there's only one future out there, probably is an outcome of a colonial imagination about the future, that it's all about modernity, for example, right? That the future is really just basically informed by modernity and science, right? But then decolonization, while it challenges the view that the future is not just about the the modernist science, like for example, like that there are many other ways of knowing, like for example, your culture, or your language, your spirit, the way people perceive their ancestry, among other things, is what informs decolonization. So decolonization, gives you the agency to actually like be aware of it, and then once there is an awareness of it, that you can in fact reclaim and recover those meanings and use those meanings to reperceive, possibilities. So it leads to some sort of a diversification or heterogeneity, not just pluralism per se, but heterogeneity within the pluralism that we do in foresight, right? Like, so the many unknowable aspects in the way we do foresight can be some sort of accentuated, amplified by the coloniality, right? So imagine the past, Stephen, before the colonial era, right? Like urbanization was different, right? There was a totality of differentiation in the way this civilization imagined urbanization, if you can call them that, right? Like for example, the Aztecs, right? It was a different type of, right, like civilization, and then you go to Asia, right, before the colonial era, right?
Yeah, I think of the Incas. I've been to Peru a bunch of times. I think of there's three layers in buildings when you see them. There's the like I even think civilization there is older than we think, but it's like the early Inca, like, and then there's the Incan Empire era, and then there's the colonial, and you can see it in places like Cusco. And yeah, the changes in attitude and changes in perceived future is very different, but there's still a connection to their heritage and their land. That a lot of that has been, I would say, wiped out in the United States, and it gets me thinking about another thing you've talked about, is that needing to move beyond, and for those that do futures work, this is pretty standard, but those who don't, or just listening, just curious about this, we talk about possible, probable, and plausible futures, like the things or preferred things we want. And and this with the game and other things, you want people to embrace, I love this, the preposterous, the preferable, and the transformative. It's a pretty bold expansion, and it's like, when you think about that with decolonization, what does it make you, what opens up for you when you kind of go there? Like, what does that do for you and your thoughts and the way you approach working with organizations and people?
Yeah, I would say that many of the aha moments that people get to experience are more often than not, right, derived from the preposterous future, right? Like, yeah, and if we give ourselves the space, to really like explore, for example, or even think, if you get lucky, the unthought of future, is that it gives people a sense of empowerment, right? They feel liberated when they have the opportunity to do so, right? Because of course we know this, Stephen, that the possible, the probable, and the plausible future are almost always informed by current knowledge, right?
It's more forecasting than it is foresight, to a degree.
It's data driven. Everybody loves to call it evidence based, right? But then you also have, let's just say, the preferable future, and the preferable future are types of futures that requires your judgment. And these are driven by people's and institutional values, not necessarily by the forces of change, that shapes the way you imagine the future. But then when we talk about the preferabilities, decision making comes in, right? And what I've learned in my interaction with my clients is that it brings in, the value narratives that they have since the founding of their organization, right? That the values that was essential when the organization was founded or a particular product was invented resurfaces in the construction of preferabilities, right? Because this is long term. We just don't prefer the future because our interest is in the short run. But then when we talk about preferabilities, because it takes time to actually like do these things, and sometimes people call it, at least in the companies and corporations, like for example products such as liquor or chocolate that has been there as part of their essentials in the last 50 and 70 to the next 100 years, is that when they think about the preferred future, the values that was essential or probably has been forgotten in the process resurfaces along the way.
Well, go ahead. Sorry. Anyway.
Yes, and when these things resurfaces, then you get to have an opportunity to have a conversation about the meaning that matters to them as an organization and as leaders in the process.
When you taking all of this in, and you'd mentioned to me about SciSip, right? And there's also the Global South Futures Community, which you've created or co-founded. So like that, you have an organization have impact in that way. Like, what's the vision? How does foresight look different? You just kind of touched upon some of that when it's not being, because there's a tremendous amount of stuff going on in Europe. I would say, Dubai's, the Dubai forums and their work there, but you don't hear a lot from, India, South America, just the global South. So like, what does it look like for this organization with the vision?
Yeah, the vision is, in fact, surface the idea that the future is also about relationships. That it's not just about the utility of the future to us, to invent and create something out of it, right? If you come to think about it, the way we do foresight and future studies, probably, no, of course, a layer of that, not the entirety of it, but a layer of it, and which is pretty quite evident in the way we do things, is that we get to use the future as an asset, a resource, and tool that we can change, and to use the future as an asset, tool, and resources to innovate and change today. So it's the use part is entirely utilitarian, right? That we get to make the future some sort, as among other things, that it is a thing, that we can in fact actually invent and create. But that's fine. I'm not really against that. But then the idea of the Global South Futures community is that, to expand that view that the future is not just about the utility of it, but then to amplify the idea that it is also about relationships, right? That if reality is data and data is reality, in the context of decolonial foresight from the perspective of the Global South, is that relationship is reality and realities are relationships. So it should go hand in hand, right? So the question now, yeah, so the question implicitly would suggest that, what kind of relationship do you wish to build with the future?
It makes me kind of take the through line to that, to your PhD work, right? You're taking it, looking at rivers, the cities, nature, the future of nature, really, in a way. It's, your share about your dissertation, especially like regenerative cities. I love that you talked about, how rivers kind of become invisible to cities. And, it's like, I don't want to give, you can talk about that, but I think it's fascinating work because it relates to your organization work, but it's a global thing. It's not just the South. It's a global. But I'd love for you to kind of help people kind of, probably people don't think about rivers unless it's like that's their source of water. Or it's right they live on. It's just not there. So yeah. So tell the audience more about that, because I'd love to.
Yeah. So now, just building on what I've said about the way we see the future as a form of an asset. So the way we think about the rivers in the last probably 500 years, that we've always seen these rivers as a form of an asset and a resource that we can in fact actually quarry and exploit and extract and manipulate, and the things that we do to abuse them, right, to generate wealth and progress and facilitate development. But we've seen the results of all of these things, and that propelled me to, in fact, actually, like, what's going on in here, right? Like, is there something beyond the way we see the future as mere asset? So when I started studying rivers, that I learned that rivers are, in fact, living entities. They are not just assets and resources, as how science would like to define them. From an indigenous perspective, when I started studying indigeneity in the way we see the world, is that these are living entities that we must learn to respect, right? And if they are living entities, the only way by which you can in fact interact with them is when you build a relationship with it. And the rivers has, even before cities were there, they've been there, in the past, present, and probably in the future as well. It could, in fact, outlast the city itself, right? And in that way, river also gives you, the opportunity to think in the context of the long term, right? Because nature are thousands and even, millions of years, I would say billions of years. Like rivers has been there for billions of years in this planet, So if you use rivers and nature as a variable in the way we probably like study the future, gives you a sense of an opportunity to reframe and rethink what long-termism is to us as far as a futurist is concerned, beyond the idea of technology and tech. If the unknown, here's the thing. What I learned is that if in futures and foresight we tend to fear the unknown, right? And it creates doubt, and therefore it is uncertain. We try to make sense of it so that we can in fact actually like psychologically manage this uncertainties, whatever that might be, and call it risk management in the process, right? And they become products and services, right? Now, however, in the context of indigeneity, from an indigenous perspective, is that for them, the unknown is something that we must learn to respect. Instead of fearing it, you must respect it. Look at the different ways of knowing the future. So if we embark on the idea of instead fearing the unknown, what does it mean for futures and foresight if we leverage the idea that the way for us, probably among the many other ways, and this is one of the ways that might emerge as essential in the way we do futures and foresight over the long term, like let's just say for the next 100 years, is to learn how to respect the unknowable and probably preposterous things. right? And by situating respect in the unknowables, probably could grant us, not necessarily, that the power or perhaps the agency to create, better futures for everyone, and not just for a few. That excludes, of course, rivers, for example.
What do you think in relating, kind of drawing upon that, what do you think the current state of foresight is? You and I talked about the pandemic, the transformation. People talk about transformation. I like to call it readiness theater. It's like security theater at the airport. What is your take on the state of where things are, and with regards to foresight and transformation? You've worked with so many different organizations. I mean, you've gotten, especially NGOs that have a certain perspective, or they're funded by certain, maybe they have their mission or their agendas. How would you say that the state of the spaces? Because you're touching upon some really, I would say, important, and I would say not covered well, like not addressed. It's not being addressed, and it's slowly getting there. But yeah, what is your take on the state of everything?
I would say is that the current state of foresight is too utilitarian.
Yeah, you mentioned it's kind of the safe futures, right?
We we've been complicit into it. I've been complicit into it, over the years of foresight practice, that the only way for us to create the future is to, in fact, actually invent it, right? We believe in that, right? But then inventing things is not just, the future is much more about inventing things, right? While it is essential, to our way of life and evolution as people and planet, the future is not just about that, I would say, right? It's more than that, right? And this is something that we need to figure out, right? If things evolve, and so that view, in fact, must evolve as well, beyond the idea of inventing things. And we have, in fact, actually, forgotten, or perhaps forgotten to remember that there are other things in life beyond invention, right? Right, like you have the social, the cultural, the spiritual, the natural, the meaning, the philosophy, the things that, that makes us happy, really. Like, it's not just about material things, right? Like, it's not just, the future is not just about data, I would say, Stephen, right? Like, because everything is now about data, while that is good. But then I listened to a French philosopher who recently was invited as a keynote speaker in the World Futures Day at UNESCO. He defined artificial intelligence. He's a professor who's been studying AI in the last 30 years, but he's a philosopher. He said that, AI is the hyper optimization of data. And the intention of hyper optimizing data is to sell.
True. We are the product. That's true. That's true. Well, I've been meeting a lot of young futurists. People are thinking about this because the field is, I think, maturing in a good way. That it's hopefully getting easier to hire and easier to grow in that way. Like, what advice would you give to this next generation? Especially, things you've talked about are important. Like coming from the global South, like who might think this isn't for them? Like, what advice would you, if they're listening to this, what advice would you give them?
Fundamentally, it's I've been wondering about this as well. Like, for example, after I finished my PhD, what would my practice look like probably for the next 10 years? As I've been into consulting work, among other things, I will still continue to do it, but then I might, situate and place my practice in the context of philosophy, Stephen.
Okay. Okay. Well, specific kinds of philosophy, or just philosophy in general, like per se? Okay. Yeah.
Philosophy, but of course, philosophy per se, right? Like,
Yeah. What do you think, as we kind of get to, getting toward the end of our show here is, I like, we don't predict the future, but I love, like, what do you is something that you believe everyone should be preparing, something people should be preparing for, like let's just say a highly possible future instead of prediction. Like, what should people be getting ready for?
Yeah, that's a pretty quite, hard
Deep question. Wait to the next one. Wait to the next one. Wait to our final one.
for. In fact, that is.
That's like, are we facing, an ecological, right? Is it dystopian? Is it an ecological disaster? Is it an AI, like ASI? Like, is it a, nuclear fusion, like, changing in the energy, availability? And there's a lot out there. But what's in the world for you? Like, what do you think might occur? Is it possible? We'll see.
I think, so I've said from the very start of this interview, right, like in the context, for example, of dystopia, like that we don't get to choose what our crises are, right? So we can only prepare enough, but then what it is essential really is, learning, making sense and knowing what exactly knowing exactly what adaptation really is, what it means to us, right? And I think improvisation is pretty quite essential in today's world, especially when everything is, driven by data.
That's a great answer. Prepare for improvisation. I mean, that's a great. Usually people get more prescriptive or hard. That's great.
If we get better at that, we've seen how artists in fact actually like influence the future as well. Artists has always been so impactful in a way that it changes the way we see ourselves.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch upon something you talked about your practice once you finished the PhD, like your practice for the next 10 years. So, when you're much older, like if you're looking back, what type of impact do you hope it'll have on the world? Like, how do you want to be your work to be remembered or thought of as a?
I don't know, Stephen. I don't really know.
That is just as good of an answer too. And I some people have a very firm answer, others don't. It's a totally fair thing. I think, it evolves in so many ways. And it's a totally fair question. So what I'd love people to do is check out your work, and especially Dreams Disruptions. There's lots of stuff in the show notes and links for people to check out. But like, where do people in general like find more about you and like Dreams and Disruptions, the book coming out, your work? How about this? What's the wellspring? What's the head of the river for everything to find you?
Yes. So of course I've had my own website, right? Like my business website it's the Center for Engaged Foresight. And then, of course, you also have the Dreams and Disruptions game website. I'm out of stock at the moment, but the new iteration will come out around like July or August. The game continues to evolve, and I am currently like publishing a lot of things at the moment, and then I'm planning to like write a book probably in the next 2 years. So I'm into writing at this point of my career, Stephen. Probably share what my reflections are as far as futurist knowledge and practice is concerned. And
definitely want to have you back for round 2. Like, yeah, we definitely want to do that at some point. That would be great. Yeah. So, well, look, I just want to say thanks for being on the show, and it was such a great, I would say, very relevant and unique conversation. And just thank you for your time, and just great to talk with you.
Thank you, Stephen, for the opportunity as well. And then, looking forward to having more conversations with you in the near future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Think Forward podcast. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms and at www.thinkforwardshow.com, as well as on YouTube under Think Forward Show. See you next time.